Hey everyone, this is an introduction to the book Looking for the Proletariat, Socialisme ou Barbarie and the Problem of Worker Writing by Hastings-King. I'm reading this introduction mostly for the historical background of Socialisme ou Barbarie. I don't know how much I'm going to actually read of this book. My interests in the Socialisme ou Barbarie are particularly on the Russian question, and this book isn't about them. Obviously, it's it's background, but you know, I'll read like the basic stuff from it though. Is this table of contents says 1. Where things start. 2. Rethinking revolutionary theory. 3. Frame on Claude Lafort's L'expérience prolétarienne. 4. Working class politics at Renaud Bilancourt. And 5. Looking for the working class. 6. Reading Daniel Motte. There's some kind of text here. I don't know what this is, but it says, it's funny, Russ says, but I think it was Charlotte put the look on my face. The lady or the city? Definitely the city. I spent years in a studio redoing recreations of big league games. The telegraph bug clacking in the background and blabbermouth Hodges inventing 99% of the action. And I'll tell you something, Scout's honor. I know this sounds far-fetched, but I used to sit there and dream of doing real baseball from a booth in the Polo Grounds in New York. Real baseball. That's something that happens in the sun. Somebody hands you a piece of paper filled with letters and numbers, and you have to make a ball game out of it. You create the weather, flesh out the players, you make them sweat and gross and hitch up their pants, and it's remarkable. Think, Russ, how much earthly disturbance, how much summer and dust the mind can manage to order up from a single Latin letter lying flat. Footnote says DeLillo, 1997. I know DeLillo is a famous American author, I believe, but I don't know anything else about him. There's the acknowledgement that says, this book is based on my 1999 doctoral dissertation, the research for which would have been impossible without the generosity of the French Ministry of Culture, which provided me with a bourse Chateaubriand for the academic year 1991 to 1992, and the Fulbright program of the USIA. While in Paris, I met and interviewed members of Socialisme ou Barbarie. I cannot adequately express my appreciation for their hospitality and willingness to talk. Jean Amery, Hélène Arnault, Daniel Blanchard, Pierre Blachier, Jacques Blot, Cornelius Castoriadis, André Charconnet, Sébastien de Diesbach, Jacques Gautrat, Martine Gautrat, André Lyotard, Maurice Courriès, Alberto Masso, Georges Petit, Jacques Signorelli, Henri Simon, Verdier. The following people provided me with internal papers from their private collections: Hélène Arnault, Daniel Blanchard, Cornelius Castoriadis, Henri Simon, Jacques Signorelli, Verdier. I examined the papers deposited at l'Institut Mémoire de l'Édition Contemporaine in Paris by Jacques Gautrat, Daniel Motte. I thank Olivier Corpet for his generosity. Henri Simon went to great lengths to make me feel welcome, introduce me to people, and provide me with documents. Even after all this time, I still feel badly that the last parcel got fouled up in the mail and hope that no harm was done. Scott McClem graciously provided me with documentations and information about the correspondence group, and Kent Worcester information on Johnson Forest. Patrick Fredinson, Dick Howard, and Joel Whitebook provided considerable help in the early stages of my research, for which I am grateful. My thanks to my graduate committee, Dominic LaCapra, Stephen Kaplan, and David Sabian, and to my friends from Cornell, wherever they may be, and to Jerry O'Sullivan, who put me onto Castoriadis in the first place. This book comes long after the dissertation. My thanks to David Ames Curtis and Clara Gibson Maxwell for the belief in this project from the beginning, and to Gavin Walker for myriad discussions in Philadelphia and afterward that helped keep me connected to this phase of my work, even as I was engaged in other things. David Ames Curtis, Kelly Grotka were of immense help in the final stages of preparation. My thanks to the Historical Materialism Collective, Sebastian Budgeon, and David Broder in particular. Encountering and entering deeply into the work of Cornelius Castoriadis changed me, and I had the privilege of getting to know him personally. I dedicate this book to Cornelius Castoriadis' memory. So here we are. Here's the actual thing I was here to read. Introduction. Socialisme ou Barbarie was one of the most important and influential Marxist groups to emerge after World War II. Centered in Paris around writers like Cornelius Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, Daniel Motte, Pierre Souris, and Jean-François Lyotard, the group engaged in a sustained, intensive, critical interaction with post-war capitalism, politics, and culture through the lens of Marx. The group began in 1946 as the Chalut Montal Tendency, part of the left opposition in the late 1940s Trotskyism. It split to become an independent group in 1949. By its 1967 dissolution, Socialisme ou Barbarie was arguing for the rejection of Marx and Marxism in the name of revolution. The 40 issues of the journal Socialisme ou Barbarie, appearing between 1949 and 1966, conveyed to a significant audience of left students and intellectuals both the group's vision of socialism as autonomy, instituted through direct democratic workers' councils, and their insistence that revolutionary theory must be grounded in a rigorous critical theory of contemporary capitalism. The group was a central player in debates about Marxism, revolutionary politics, and decolonization that conditioned the, quote, New Left, which began to take shape in France during 1957. Innovative political organizations like the Collective that published Argument and L'Internationale Situationniste were deeply marked by Socialisme ou Barbarie and its critique of the USSR and Stalinism, its approach to Marxism, and its vision of direct democratic socialism. Socialisme ou Barbarie was crucial in the debates over the implications of Gaullism for working-class politics that crystallized what later became the, quote, Sociologie du travail, the sociology of work, and was a consistent radical critic of both the Algerian War and the tiers-mondiste interpretation of the Front de Libération Nationale that were then fashionable among the student and intellectual anti-war movement. I guess that's third worldist interpretations. The group's radically democratic politics informed the autogestionnaire, self-management, intellectual current that flourished in left industrial politics during the 1960s and 1970s. The journals like Autogestion and organizations like the CFDT, Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail. Footnote. There's two footnotes, one that I missed and one that's immediate here. I'll read the one that's right here at first. The journal Autogestion et Socialisme, Self-Management and Socialism, was started in 1965 by current and former members of Socialisme ou Barbarie, including Yvonne Bourdet and Alain Guillern. Daniel Motte wrote for the journal in its early period as well. for the centrality of Socialisme ou Barbarie as a reference point in the initial articulation of autogestion et socialisme. Theoretical position, see Bourdais' article from 1963 titled Les contradictions de la hétérogestion and Les conditions de possibilité de la autogestion. End footnote. The footnote in this said, Socialisme ou Barbarie refers both to the group and to the title of the journal they collectively produced. When the name refers to the group, it appears in its regular font. When it refers to the journal, it appears in italics. End footnote. Diffracted through the prism of Guy Debord's situationist art/politics, Socialisme ou Barbarie was also a key influence on the ideology behind the May 1968 student revolt. Footnote. The only systematic expression of a, quote, 68 ideology, Daniel Cohn-Bendit's Obsolete Communism, the Left-Wing Alternative, published in 1968, was almost entirely plagiarized from Socialisme ou Barbarie. In my April 1993 interview, former Socialisme ou Barbarie member Alberto Masso Vega counted 78 pages in the original French edition that were taken directly from Socialisme ou Barbarie articles without attribution, and claimed that the rest was actually written by Danny's brother, Gabriel Cohn-Bendit, a former participant in Socialisme ou Barbarie. End footnote. Despite all this, Socialisme ou Barbarie remains largely unknown, particularly in the English-speaking world. Its collective work was fragmented by the publication of anthologies undertaken by individuals in the early 1970s. Footnote. 10/18 published multiple volumes of Castoriadis' Socialisme ou Barbarie writings, supplemented with other material, most of which postdated Socialisme ou Barbarie through the 1970s. Lafort's collection Éléments pour une critique de la bureaucratie, which appeared in 1971 from Droz, reprinted as Lafort, 1979, was the first collection to separate individual contributions from those of the group. These publications were invaluable on their own, both for the text and the extensive information they provided about Socialisme ou Barbarie. Because they had better distribution than did the journal, they exposed to a wider audience the ideas that Socialisme ou Barbarie had developed. At the same time, they had the effect of making the group appear to be Castoriadis, Lafort, and a bunch of other people, to the chagrin of many of the members of the group I spoke with while researching this book. This project tries to treat Socialisme ou Barbarie as a collective. Much of it is focused on Daniel Motte. But the internal documentation that would have enabled a more fleshed out look at the collective in action mostly pertains to the period after this project stops. End footnote. David Ames Curtis translated and published much of Cornelius Castoriadis' work. If you're interested, I have the first 2 volumes of those collected works on this channel. Footnote. See his translation of the 3-volume set of Castoriadis' political and social writings published by the University of Minnesota. The Agora International Bibliographic Project cannot be recommended too highly as a resource for people interested in Castoriadis' work. One second. Oh crap, I accidentally exited out of the document. Just wanted to copy down this the note. Come on. Let's see if I can. What was the last word I said? Okay, I got right back to where I was. End footnote. Other scholars like Dick Howard have long drawn attention to that of Claude Lafort. or cloud before. In the United States, the reception accorded to the work by Socialisme ou Barbarie and its members' subsequent writings was largely confined to academic settings. Their transdisciplinary character seemed to have caused them to fall through the cracks. They were too philosophical for politics, too political for philosophy. In other areas, their reception was confused because the works did not operate from the same assumptions as the, quote, French theory that was then dominant. The situation was different for Lyotard. But Lyotard's work on the Algerian War, completed while Lyotard was part of Socialisme ou Barbarie, was presented to an English-speaking audience in a way that disconnected it from his later writing. Footnote. The fragmenting of Lyotard's work is reflected in the arbitrariness of the book's organization. End footnote. The journal Socialisme ou Barbarie itself has never been translated. Footnote. Scans of some issues can be found at the Subscans project. As of this writing, PDFs are available for the first 10 issues. Members of Socialisme ou Barbarie collectively edited Socialisme Barbarie une anthologie. I guess I don't think it says this on the actual book, that collection, but it says here that it was edited by Henri Simon. End footnote. An indication of this combination of invisibility and influence can be found in the sense of the tradition of direct democratic political action particular to the U.S. Occupy movement, inspired in general by the Spanish 15M and in particular by a call to action from adbusters. The movement has been contextualized within a history of the Situationists. Footnote. Mackenzie Wark's newer work on the Situationists seems to me to formalize his understanding of a past that links the occupation to les situs. End footnote. There is little sense of an engagement that goes beyond that to the group that fundamentally shaped de Boer's politics. End footnote. Well, no footnote, sorry. Perhaps this book can play a small role in changing this state of affairs by inspiring interest in both Socialisme ou Barbarie and the later work done by people associated with the group. As of yet, the political appropriations of Socialisme ou Barbarie have been shaped by the same conflict that tore the group apart, the simultaneous desire to develop a radical critique of contemporary capitalism and remain Marxist. For some, Marxism remains the legitimate language of dissent, but it has been collapsed back into a textual tradition that primarily enables what Pierre Lagnier called, quote, a rationalization of alienation, end quote. While it can provide useful heuristics in certain situations, Marxism is now one framework amongst others. As a theoretical framework, it is no longer adequate to comprehend contemporary capitalism or new forms of radical contestation. Its own history has pulverized it as a language of political mobilization. One of the hopes that animated this project from its beginning was to present Socialisme ou Barbarie as something other than a merely sophisticated variant of revolutionary Marxism. In the period covered by this book, the group captured something of the collapse of the Marxist imaginary. What was captured unfolded in the heart of the Marxian project. The group itself struggled to come to terms with developments that undermined their own framework. New section. Some terminological and formal matters. The project involves some terminology borrowed from the philosophical work that Cornelius Castoriadis developed after Socialisme ou Barbarie. I use it operationally so as to organize and clarify phenomena. At times, This approach creates the anachronistic impression that Socialisme Barbarie was already using the language that Castoriadis would later fashion, which is not the case. My appropriation and use of that language arises from my work on the group itself and reflects my understanding of its trajectory. For example, the notion of the Marxist imaginary was inspired by Castoriadis. When I came up with the term in the early 1990s, I had the idea of presenting a full-blown account of it. This ambition resulted in many adventures, relearning the Marxist textual tradition and the ways it shaped and had been shaped by the histories of the main political organizations and of the workers' movement, trying to explain the royalism that links Trotsky's interpretation of Stalin to the gifts offered to the friend of the children and conqueror of happiness for his 70th birthday, following the echoes of the Bukharin Trail to Edgar Morin's puzzling account of the imitation show trials in the PCF in the early 1950s. These adventures ran alongside various attempts to generate an account of Socialisme Barbarie using the journal in tandem with interviews and internal documents that referred to densities of context that ran well beyond what I had imagined when I arrived in Paris from a place in which deconstruction was confused with a radical politics. The results were endless drafts for potential chapters. Most ended up in boxes. They formed the invisible surround for what you are reading. Eventually I realized that the book itself is a map of a spatially and temporally specific version of the Marxist imaginary, conditioned by the conventions that obtained while I was making it. The sort of account I initially dreamed of would be a manifold, an open series of other such books, film clips, sound recordings, images and artifacts, memories and experiences. As is the case for any social imaginary formation, the Marxist imaginary is nothing but versions. Here is another. From the viewpoint of method, what follows is an alteration between historical sociology and the close reading of text. The project is split in two. The first part concerns Socialisme Barbarie directly. The second concerns the problem of worker writing. The two are intricately intertwined. Each part opens with a sociological frame and moves into engagement with text. As a function of the differences that separate the space of small Parisian militant groups from that of the Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, the results are divergent. The relations to context in the analyses that follow track the situation of Socialisme Barbarie. In the early chapters, they are central. In the fourth chapter, the group is marginal. The last two strike different balances. While a more detailed overview is provided in the following section of this introduction, it is useful to give a schematic version here in order to highlight some of the main thematic and formal features of the book. The first chapter situates Socialisme Barbarie in the context of the anti-Stalinist left politics immediately after World War II. It uses elements drawn from the work of Pierre Bourdieu to highlight the ways in which the sociological conditions shaped and constrained the group. The departure from Trotskyism put the group in terrain littered with short-lived organizations. The members responded by instituting an internal process of critical engagement with Lenin and Marx that enabled Socialisme Barbarie to be an explicit collective self-creation. The chapter stages this early period with that in mind. Chapters 2 and 3 follow the fleshing out of a version of the Marxist imaginary in the pages of Socialisme Barbarie. The group's analysis of the 1953 East Berlin June days emphasized worker reappropriation of the language of revolutionary Marxism, a development that became a template for understanding autonomous worker actions, all of which activated this language to express their opposition to the situations in which they found themselves. It was revolutionary language because they organized in opposition to Communist Party-dominated context. The reappropriation also enabled these workers to take over subject positions as revolutionary activists. The way in which this process worked were shaped fundamentally by conditions at the point of production. The interactions of these factors were performed through direct democratic forms of collective self-organization that workers adopted and in the types of demands they generated. Autonomous worker action enacted a relation to the language of the Marxist tradition that paralleled Socialisme Barbarie's own. While the Marxist imaginary refers to the entire range of socio-cognitive creations, instituted in ways shaped by the sedimented history of that tradition, For Socialisme ou Barbarie, the language is fundamental, as were the modes of self-organization enabled by it. In the West, Marxism was the legitimate discourse for framing opposition to capitalism and the range of political options associated with it. Texts and arguments rooted in them play a more important role in oppositional politics than they do for dominant ideological positions. The continuities of everyday life are de facto arguments for the legitimacy of the dominant order. As noted above, for Socialisme ou Barbarie, the reappropriation of the language of revolution by workers was shaped by their everyday experience at the point of production. The third chapter frames this understanding and the claim that only workers can know, and by extension write about, that experience, a claim premised on the group's critique of Leninism. It then outlines the formal characteristics of the type of worker writing Socialisme ou Barbarie valorized. Chapters 2 and 3 are rooted in types of close reading, to the extent that it is an expanded variant of ordinary reading. The exclusion of problematic relations to context follows from close reading. In these chapters, the exclusion is symmetrical with Socialisme ou Barbarie's collective relations to its immediate environment. From that situation, workers are objects of intense interest and political investment. The factory is an elsewhere. The text stage workers in the factory as from a distance. The worker narratives that Socialisme ou Barbarie published in the journal can be read entirely within the interpretive framework of the journal. But the texts the group published, most of which concern the French automobile industry of the mid-1950s, are the only first-person accounts of worker experience in the factories under the industrial Fordism of the period. Most focus on the experience of machinists under pressure of production reorganization and de-skilling, as well as production speed-ups. The trade unions could not or would not address such quality of work issues as a function of their integration into collective bargaining. Unlike the collages of strike reports and related analyses also published in Socialisme ou Barbarie, these narratives provide a degree of temporal continuity in the staging of shop floor relations. They describe informal mechanisms whereby workers could mobilize in order to draw attention to quality of work problems. In their use of the language of revolution, they conform to the pattern described in the analysis of East Berlin, but in these more continuous narratives, autonomous worker actions figure in two directions, one in the context of the group's revolutionary project and another at Billancourt. Separating these registers so they can interact in a more complex manner than would be the case were they treated simply as elements in a narrative of the group's development is one of the tasks that shapes the second half of this book. Chapter 3 introduces the problematic of worker writing, which is the central concern of this book. From this point, Socialisme ou Barbarie itself, as an ongoing practical elaboration, becomes a secondary motif. With Chapter 4, we move into an overview of the sociological context that obtained at Renault's Billancourt factory, the main setting for the group's efforts to solicit workers to write. Chapter 5 discusses the Detroit-based worker newspaper Correspondence, its organization and outputs. The successor to the Johnson Forest tendency, Correspondence was a fundamental interlocuteur and foil for Socialisme ou Barbarie's collective understanding of the workers' newspaper as an organizational tool and source for worker writing. I then discover the fraught relations between the groups before moving to Tribune Ouvrière. While never a worker newspaper in the sense Socialisme ou Barbarie would have preferred, it was nonetheless an important source for information about everyday experience in the French automobile industry in the journal. My reading of Tribune Ouvrière goes beyond this frame and treats it as a documentary source. The final chapter centers on Socialisme ou Barbarie member Jacques Guitry, who wrote a series of narratives about his experience at Billancourt for the journal between late 1956 and 1957 under the name Daniel Motte. It positions Motte as inside and outside, a pseudonym and an identity as a Socialisme ou Barbarie member, Motte, and a worker at Renault. Guitry. Motte was the group's worker, and his texts the main exemplars of the sort of worker writing its members hoped to gather. But what these narratives track is a disinvestment in the language of revolutionary Marxism on the part of workers. The position of Motte's narratives in Socialisme Barbarie reconfigures what is documented as unfolding amongst the worker avant-garde in the abstract factory at the heart of the Marxist imaginary. At the same time, positioning these narratives with reference to Guittraux's experiences at Billancourt makes the descriptions particular. These two possibilities alternate in an interesting manner. The book does not treat this as a problem and makes no attempt to, quote, solve it. Motte provides glimpses of a disinvestment in the Marxist imaginary that plays out in the socially instituted relations to the language of revolution that enabled autonomous worker mobilizations at Billancourt. From an analytic viewpoint, describing a disruption in the relation of the instituted to the instituting is a problem, one of bringing clarity to registers of social being that are invisible but which are no less fundamental for that. The register of the institute involves effective, cognitive, and social relations to the language of the Marxist imaginary. Footnote. Throughout what follows, you will also find the notion of a social imaginary signification. Castoriadis refers to a signification as skeins of referrals, end quote, provisional nodes and dense networks of associations. In this, the notion is analytical, but it indicates something of ways of living through, or projecting a version of the present and vision of the future predicated on ideas of a politically, ethically, and personally more desirable future. Significations are instituted to the extent that they are condensed expressions of a collective history, and instituting to the extent that these expressions shape cognitive and affective styles, that is, patterns of investment and projection. End footnote. There is a problem of how to talk about the instituting at all, one that is compounded by the fact that the withdrawal of consent did not affect our relations to the language. By 1957, Marxism was primarily an organizational ideology, a language used by political parties, for example, to speak to and about themselves. At these registers, the production of the language was not interrupted. Motte describes a history without events. This seems characteristic of the death of a social imaginary formation. Those invested in it, who inhabit the world shaped by it, would have great difficulty processing the disintegration of their own frame of reference. Those outside are unlikely to capture such granular phenomena. In the last chapter, I refer to disinvestment as the breakdown of language games. This is not theorized in Socialisme Barbarie. In early 1957, the group saw itself atop the crest of a mounting wave of proletarian revolutionary activity and took the events in Hungary and the ensuing Soviet suppression as massive confirmations of their assumptions concerning new revolutionary activity and direct democratic forms of self-organization. The group also found itself with a larger audience than it had previously enjoyed, both in terms of readership and those who attended the group's public meetings. They were not looking for what Motte described. Neither, for that matter, was Motte. The project ends with this analysis. I confronted the problem of managing length, and this choice provided a solution. The endpoint leaves open the questions that follow from the worker disinvestment in the basis for the Marxist imaginary, captured in Motte's text. It stops before the Aldine affair and Algerian war began the transformation of the Parisian left, typically characterized as the transition from, quote, old to, quote, new left. The shift hinged on the mobilization of new social groups, students, intellectuals, and create a context that made of the working class a construction that could be classified as imaginary in a quite different sense, an abstract function operative in the text that introduced these actors to the legitimate language of oppositional politics. The implications of this transition were occulted in a transfer of political energy. In the 1964 essay, Marxism and Revolutionary Theory, Castoriadis wrote that conditions had reached such a pass that one could either be Marxist or a revolutionary. The question posed here is whether the Marxist imaginary had already been pulverized by its own history as early as 1957. Because the group's trajectory performs and articulates that crisis on another level, the implications of this early moment would have been domesticated had this book integrated them into an episode in the narrative of the progressive unfolding of Socialisme Barbarie's overall project. I write this in 2013, at a time when even a cursory assessment of the fate of the Marxist imaginary should make it clear that the surviving aspects of the imaginary are inoperative politically and dated conceptually. Continuing to invest in Marxism as an adequate descriptive or political language is no longer to engage in a form of praxis that may change the world. It is the rearrangement of elements in a curiosity cabinet. The disposition of a militant has been replaced by that of a collector. The rationalization of alienation is all there is. The collector's organization and reorganization of a closed system of discursive elements enables the avoidance of both Marxism's conceptual and political problems, and of thinking the possibilities for basic social transformation that continue to be posited in the present. To rethink those possibilities requires an accompanying philosophical transformation, to take up what Castoriadis called the, quote, project of autonomy, end quote. We reach this place at the end of the project. Now we start over. New section on the construction of the worker. This project is focused on Socialisme Barbarie's construction of the worker. A brief rehearsal of the traditional Marxist conception of revolution will help to set up what Socialisme Barbarie was trying to do. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels present the idea of a politics of revolution in the context of a conception of history that moves in stages. The movement from one to the next is dialectical. Each stage takes shape within the previous as its negation. Revolution is the moment of transcendence, one that suppresses some attributes of the previous stage while conserving and transforming others. Each historical stage is the expression of a dominant rationality, a way of shaping and organizing information that reflects and reproduces social relations, both amongst people and to the natural world. Because each such rationality operates by exclusions, each provides space within itself for the development of other social logics. Bourgeois society grows out of the forms of commercial interactions that took shape largely in towns, in opposition to the dominant, aristocratic rationality that Marx attributes to the feudal period. The French Revolution marked the transition from one stage to the next, just as capitalism had supplanted feudalism through a process that culminated in a revolution, so socialism would supplant capitalism, with the proletariat acting as the transformative agent. Just as bourgeois rationality had constituted itself within and against aristocratic society, around notions of formal equality, private property, and social relations mediated by money, so the proletariat would enact the basis for a rationality rooted in the suppression of private property and the institution of the collective management of production and society. Capitalism produced socialism's conditions of possibility in the context of industrial production. The task of revolutionary politics was to facilitate the recognition of commonalities, which would result in the transition from the working class as a class in itself to a class for itself, from workers who happen to occupy similar positions in the production process to a class aware of itself as a class and conscious of its own interests. Industrial production was crucial, not only because it provided the material basis for social reproduction, but also because it was the most advanced expression of bourgeois thinking and technical development. The proletariat was itself a creation of capitalism. Marx saw in the situation of the working class in capitalist production the condition of the possibility of social revolution. This view leans on a form of double consciousness. To the extent that each worker is a socially functional subject, each is shaped by the dominant imaginary, but the relations are circumscribed by class position. It follows from the general relation characteristic of workers to the dominant imaginary would be one of simultaneous inclusion and exclusion. But for Marx, it is the confrontation with actual capitalist production that is determinate. When a worker sells his or her labor power for a wage and enters the space of production, that worker encounters the reality that is shaped and concealed by what Marx called ideology. Technological design, the organization of work, and the system of wages are material expressions of the bourgeois subordination of human relations and of an instrumental rationality that operates on a world comprised of objects. When Marx characterized capitalist production in the 1844 manuscripts, Marx juxtaposed it with an ideal typical image of artisanal production. Craft-based production presupposed workers who possess skill. Its technologies require active kinetic engagement to operate. Work is a social undertaking. The scale of production is small enough to enable workers to know the whole process and understand the disposition of the objects produced. In capitalist production, technologies perform most of the skilled operations. The work is individuated and repetitive. The sense of involvement with a coherent process is fragmented. The scale of production separates workers from the disposition of the commodities that are produced. For Marx, by shattering the workers' primary mode of meaningful interaction with themselves and the material world, capitalism takes from them what makes them human. Alienation reduces workers to the status of an object, to an appendage of the machine. Taken as an ethical argument, alienation is a tendency rather than an accomplishment. By granting workers a degree of space within a production that does not entirely dehumanize them, this view would make of the experience of production the basis for an imminent critique of capitalism. This conception places workers, inside and outside, both participants in and capable of making judgments about that system. Such a relation is the basis for the double consciousness that endows the workers with the possibility of mobilizing as a class to become the agent of the suppression of capitalism. This viewpoint is close to that adopted by Socialisme or Barbarie. However, if one takes this description as factual, rather different consequences result. The image of the relations of production outlined in the earlier Marx is both subjectively oriented and static. In Capital, Marx rendered dynamic the relations of production by situating them in the networks that are constitutive of capital. These comprise the centerpiece of his model of competitive capitalism. The model links the exploitation of workers in their everyday experience and production to overall system dynamics. The quote, organic crisis of capital. The declining rate of profit in particular drives capitalist firms to maximize exploitation through increasing the speed of work and or length of the working day. The same pressures are expressed in decreasing wages. Inside production, technological developments enact a logic that equates efficiency with de-skilling. De-skilling makes workers interchangeable. Through processes like enclosure, the corrosive effects of capitalist property relations result in a stream of people driven from older forms of rural production to the cities in search of work. The result is an increasing immiseration of the proletariat. Workers organize themselves into trade unions and struggle to improve their situation. But from this viewpoint, capitalism cannot accommodate their demands. The overall dynamic of capitalism results in a spiraling deterioration in the lives of working people, both inside and outside the factories. Revolution would be the exposition of desperate working people, already dehumanized by capitalist production. Amongst more orthodox Marxists of the 1940s and 50s, there was a general agreement about this version of Marx. The sociological historical analysis of concrete relations of production could produce snapshots. A dynamic understanding required a shift into a mode of economic analysis that emphasized the objective forces that shaped capitalism as a system. Dialectical materialism assumed that the capitalism of Marx described was shaped by a sort of essence. Capitalism was made over as a closed system in which there was reality, the space governed by these forces, and the accidental, which included everything else. Emphasis on objective forces reduced the working class to a function. Lukash's definition of class consciousness as the alignment of working class actions with objective necessity was a blunt statement of an assumption shared by most orthodox Marxists. This corresponds to a miserablest view of workers, dehumanized by capitalist relations of production. It is not surprising that this form of Marxian analysis would become dominant with the Third International. It integrates into the center of the revolutionary politics the need for a vanguard party. In the Marxian tradition, the violent suppression of the Paris Commune in 1870 triggered a rethinking of revolutionary. That's 1871. This should be a year there. In the Marxian tradition, the violent suppression of the Paris Commune in 1870 triggered a rethinking of revolutionary organization along military lines. Lenin's organization was a culmination of this process. Lenin's claim that trade unionism is the highest level of political consciousness that workers will aspire to, if left to themselves, corresponds to the miserablest understanding of the working class. Footnote. As an aside, the trade union movement was one of the great accomplishments of the late 19th, early 20th century workers' movement. However, from the viewpoint of revolutionary theory, the trade union movement followed the logic that Edward Bernstein had elaborated in the debates that split social democrats from revolutionaries in Germany just before World War I. If changes in the organization of capitalism meant that revolution had to be seen as a longer-term prospect, it followed that the trade union movement should interact with capital on the best possible terms in order to ameliorate the situation of working people in the short run. This marked a definitive split of revolutionary from reformist politics. Socialisme and Barbarie followed this general logic, but reframed it in terms of their theory of bureaucratic capitalism. End footnote. Socialisme and Barbarie rejected the orthodox understandings of history and of the nature of revolutionary political action. Orthodox Marxism understood capitalism as a variant of an object. The laws that Marx isolated were, in essence, spread out in time. For reasons that we will analyze in the first chapter below, Socialisme and Barbarie historicized the model that Marx fashioned of mid-19th century capitalism. What made the model important to begin with was not the isolation of overall system characteristics, but rather the effects of these characteristics on the situation of a working people. So if one historicized the model but retained a focus on understanding the situation of workers, one kept to the political heart of Marx's analysis. This enabled the group to argue that the reconfigurations of capitalist organization, driven by the tendency to concentration, were equivalent changes. To be coherent on Marxian grounds, revolutionary theory had to account for these changes and work to locate and empower forms of revolutionary action symmetrically with them. To do this, Socialisme and Barbarie adopted a sociological-oriented approach to the relations of production. The group's construction of the worker as a social imaginary signification followed from this move. But the turn to the social historical raised the problem of how theory, embedded by virtue of the class position of the theorist in the rationality that revolutionary action would overturn, could access the germinal forms of the rationality that would be generalized as socialism through the process of revolution. The solution the group settled on was to encourage workers to write about their own experiences at the point of production. New section. Overview. What you have been reading to this point assumes other features of Socialisme and Barbarie's project. So we turn to an overview. Socialisme and Barbarie began its trajectory as an independent group when the Chalut Mental tendencies split with the Trotskyist Parti Communiste Internationaliste (PCI) in 1949. The tendency was started in 1946 by Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lafleur around, quote, the Russian question. Trotsky had argued that the USSR was, quote, basically socialist, end quote, and that the Stalinist bureaucracy was an expression of Stalin's illegitimacy as Lenin's successor. Against this, the Chalut Mental tendency developed a quite different analysis, one that took Soviet bureaucracy seriously. The result was a comprehensive theory of bureaucratic capitalism that enabled the tendency to argue that, from a viewpoint informed by the analysis of the relations of production, the Soviet system was a new form of capitalism. The fusion of party and state created a centralized bureaucratic apparatus that managed Fordist-style production design in the same kind of top-down, command-oriented manner as its Western counterparts. But the power of the party apparatus removed the brakes that limited the exploitation of workers in Western forms of capital. It was all the worst features of capitalism made even worse. The early issues of Socialisme Barbarie are largely taken up with the demolition of associations linking Stalinism to socialism and of the Trotskyist interpretations that claimed as much. The group linked the nature of the Soviet system to the Leninist vanguard party. Both bureaucratic capitalist management and the Leninist party separated the dirigeants from the executants. I guess that's order givers from order takers. Those who issue commands from those who carry them out. This division of intellectual labor was the defining characteristic of bureaucratic capitalism in general. In the Leninist context, this separation derived from the same miserablest notion of the working class that was inscribed in orthodox Marxism. The claim that the Soviet system was not socialist raised the question of what socialism was. From the outset, the group emphasized that the worker collective, management of production and its outputs, would be the defining criterion. This position was argued by appealing to history. The abolition of private property and the expropriation of capitalists had not by itself resulted in socialism in the USSR, because the problematic nature of the division of intellectual labor was not recognized. The Soviet system enabled revolutionary militants to understand that mistake. The centrality of worker control to socialism was not a new idea. It was a main slogan in the Russian Revolution, just as the Soviets were to be the instruments that allowed it to be exercised. But the way Socialisme Barbarie conceptualized it, particularly after the revolt in East Berlin and French general strikes of the summer 1953, was to elaborate its notion of socialism as direct democracy. Chapter 2 provides a detailed reconstruction of the group's analysis of the workers' actions of summer 1953. In general, the analyses show a continuum that linked conflicts at the point of production over the organization and pace of work to the forms adopted by what the group called autonomous worker actions. It is interesting to note that, from the outset, the group focused on the situation of semi-skilled workers and their conflicts with management, be it party or factory, as involving fundamental questions about the management of work. Skill becomes the implicit center of the group's vision of worker autonomy and the enabling condition for conflicts at the point of production to issue into the germinal forms of socialist rationality. Conceptually, Socialisme Barbarie linked autonomous workers' actions, their forms of self-organization and demands, back to everyday experience at the point of production. Central to this linkage is their notion of bureaucratic capitalism. For Socialisme Barbarie, bureaucracy designates a process that converges across its manifestations on the separation of the dirigeant from executant, order givers from order takers. It is an eidos, or a form that is best understood as resulting from a phenomenological interrogation. As a form, it provided the group with a device for unifying a considerable range of phenomena. As an analytical device, it was sufficiently abstract to allow the introduction of detail and grain. At the same time, it was a theoretical move that enabled modes of passing from the particular to the general. Bureaucratic capitalism as a general phenomenon was expressed at the level of concrete relations of production through a fundamental contradiction. In a Western context, Fordist management operated by imposing a rigid top-down understanding of production on a shifting, complex environment. This tended to individuate workers and exclude them from creative interaction with their work in a manner symmetrical with the design logic of assembly line technologies. But the imposition of this production design in a complex shifting environment generated problems and irrationalities, the addressing of which required workers to interact creatively with their work. Without that engagement, production would grind to a halt, but this register lay outside the production design that mediated the viewpoint of management. The result was ongoing confrontation between the top-down command/control structure of capitalist management and quite different conceptions of hierarchy and organization, particular to informal worker collectives. Because, in the main, trade unions had at this time shifted towards collective bargaining, they were unable to address problems connected to the pace and control of work. So in their interactions with the unions, workers confronted a situation parallel to that which they encountered with management. Autonomous worker actions like the East Berlin, quote, June days, were positive expressions of the proletarian rejection of bureaucracy. The types of self-organization and demands asserted the political nature of the conflicts at the point of production and demonstrated the inability of the dominant organizations to accommodate them. Their position outside the dominant order made them of potentially revolutionary actions. Socialisme Barbarie collectively posited the workers who participated. Socialisme Barbarie collectively posited the workers who participated in such actions as a new worker avant-garde. Their project developed as part of an ongoing dialogue with it. Many issues of the journal from this period are assemblages of information about and interpretations of these actions. The interpretations link the actions together as aspects of an overall revolutionary movement. The movement is then situated with respect to broader characteristics of bureaucratic capitalism on the one hand, and with respect to the group's teleological vision of socialism as direct democracy on the other. As with any revolutionary theory, the idea was to enable workers to take a distance from their immediate concerns and grasp the revolutionary implications of their actions. Between 1953 and 1957, the pages of Socialisme Barbarie connected many such actions into a mounting wave of revolutionary action. The East Berlin, June days, the 1955 general strikes at Nantes and Saint-Nazaire, Poland, and especially Hungary in 1956. They alone, on the French left, were looking at these actions. They alone were able to see it. The superimposition of the scheme of bureaucratic collectivism on workers' everyday experience opened space for descriptions of that experience to have a political function independent of the analyses of autonomous workers' actions. This led the group to solicit and publish autobiographical accounts of work in contemporary industry. They were written, from the inside, by workers, based on their everyday experience of production. One explanation for this followed from a rejection of the Leninist Party. Revolutionary militants could not represent the workers. This entailed the rejection of other forms of representation of working class experience from the outside, like academic sociology. Workers should represent themselves. This was basic to the notion of direct democracy. Worker writing in a style consistent with speech would give the journal a way to address an audience quite different from that which was addressed in the majority of their articles. The context of the pieces emphasized the commonalities that linked worker experience at the point of production and solicited recognition from the worker reader. In theory, this made of these texts an instrument to bring about class consciousness. They also resolved the problem of how theorists could overcome their class positions and access the germinal form of a socialist rationality that was developing through conflicts on the factory floor. Socialisme Barbarie published a range of first-person narratives written by workers that described the conditions of industrial production. These were supplemented with a, excerpt from the worker press, drawn mostly from the newspaper projects discussed below. Most of these texts are devoted to the automobile industry. The main Renault factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, just outside of Paris, was the most recurrent setting. Because of the situation within which the group operated, the texts are the only first-hand accounts of work in the automobile industry of this period. The French Communist Party had no interest in such analyses. For them, the working class was the mass of individuals who turned out for party or CGT actions. Even as they had more consistent contact with working people than did Socialisme Barbarie, smaller proletarian revolutionary groups, like the one that became Lutte Ouvrière, never broke out of the self-referential space of Trotskyist discourse. Academic sociology of the time was only beginning to turn to industrial work as an object of analysis. Such works as were produced operated with a detached observer. In this way, the sociology of work paralleled industrial sociology, which is in general an extension of management. The third chapter is a critical analysis of the project outlined in Claude Lafort's 1952 essay, L'Expérience Proletarienne, for assembling, publishing, and interpreting these worker autobiographies, and of the text it takes as the exemplar of worker writing, Paul Romano's The American Worker. Lafort's project is symmetrical with his position on revolutionary organization, one which is quite close to that outlined below in the context of the American-based correspondent collective. The task of revolutionary theory is to interpret worker actions and experience with the idea of clarifying their implications. Revolutionary organization had no independent status, and revolutionary theory should not move from interpretation to suggesting action. This article outlines a phenomenological approach to worker narratives centered on isolating and describing, quote, the proletarian standpoint, end quote. Like the narratives Lafort takes as examples, the standpoint is productivist, located on the factory floor. It consists in the sight lines and forms of motility specific to production, but extends to the experiential frames within which informal collectives of workers, delimited by shop and shift, make work a collectively organized and controlled process, and skill a collective attribute. This approach will provide a double frame that would enable access to the rationality central to the institution of socialism, one at the level of specific contents, the other at the level of the social relations that shape their meanings. This chapter then turns to a literary analysis of the specific characteristics of, quote, proletarian documentary literature. Romano's text is written with a first-person narrator who speaks in the present tense to describe experiences from a shop floor perspective. The writing remains close to the oral culture of the shop floor. The art of the text lay in the construction of sentences that intertwine the particular and general, in a way that opens the experience up to readers while providing a compelling realism effect. The conceptual underpinning of the text is a kind of phenomenology of worker experience and production that legitimates itself with reference to recognitions on the part of the worker who reads the galleys. The primary audience for the text is other workers. The function as data emerges through comparative reading. Socialisme Barbarie tried to carry out something like the project before outlined through the Worker Newspaper Project. When the group decided to gather writing from workers beyond the limits of the group and not simply reproduce text transmitted to it by other militant organizations, as was the case with the Romano piece, they attempted to move beyond the sociological space within which the group operated. They encountered a very different space at Renault's Boulogne-Billancourt factory, the symbol of working class power for the Parisian left. The fourth chapter is an overview of the political and professional context which obtained at Billancourt. Tribune Ouvrière was launched in 1954. The group that produced it was not controlled by Socialisme Barbarie, but group member Daniel Motet participated in it. Insofar as Socialisme Barbarie was concerned, the worker newspaper was modeled on the American, quote, correspondence project. The analysis of the project works on the basis of published and internal materials from Socialisme Barbarie, along with copies of both, quote, correspondence and Tribune Ouvrière. Quote, correspondence was the incarnation of the Johnson Forest tendency. Correspondence was the incarnation of the Johnson Forest tendency after it split with Trotskyism. Counting among correspondence's members C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, and Grace Lee Boggs, the group was an interlocutor of fundamental importance from the Chalut-Montal period. Quote, correspondence was predicated on the idea that workers had withdrawn from the dominant order and were already enacting socialism at the shop floor level. The job of the worker newspaper was to simply allow workers to, quote, speak. The collective saw writing as an extension of speaking. Workers therefore had a, quote, natural style of writing. Intellectuals were inclined to see in that, quote, natural style grammatical and other errors, so they had to get out of the way. Socialisme Barbarie did not see the same kind of withdrawal from the dominant ideology that their U.S. counterparts did, nor did the group operate in a context that allowed for the same assumptions concerning worker writing. Socialisme Barbarie collectively saw working class culture as dominated. From this, it followed that simply asking workers to write would be asking them to produce imitations of forms of writing understood to be legitimate. That's very interesting, actually. From this, it followed that simply asking the workers to write would be asking them to produce imitations of forms of writing understood to be legitimate. There was no contemporary exemplars of writing that remained closely tied to spoken French, so the form would have to be a construction. Tribune Ouvrière never became the worker newspaper the group hoped it would be, but for other members of the collective that produced it, that was never the point. For them, it was the focus of an experience of militant activity, a way to create contacts among workers across shops, and to transmit information about conflicts and problems. It is an invaluable source for accounts of the pressures brought to bear on semi-skilled workers in the course of Fordist production, and resulting conflicts over production speeds, hierarchy, and professional autonomy. The articles are written from a variety of styles, only some of which correlated to Socialisme Barbarie's understanding of worker writing. These articles detail the role of autonomous worker actions as a feedback loop connecting the unions, often unwilling, back to problems that arose in the pace and organization of work, questions the unions could not coherently address because of the nature of collective bargaining. Tribune Ouvrière also contextualizes the accounts published of autonomous actions in Socialisme or Barbarie by detailing the problems attending to their mobilization in heavy industry. Socialisme or Barbarie's involvement with Tribune Ouvrière revealed the specificity of the group's construction of the worker. The project had been set into motion on grounds intuitive for the members of Socialisme or Barbarie, but the political context at Billancourt filtered writing in ways almost the opposite of those which obtained in the context in which the group operated. The context reduced the sort of writing the group privileged to noise. More broadly, it indicated the class-specific nature of writing as a form of expression. Workers did not write into or for the paper. The examples of worker writing the group did publish from Tribune Ouvrière were done by political militants. The relations between these aspects of being worker are explored in the final chapter. The central character through these analyses is Jacques Gautrat, who wrote for Socialisme ou Barbarie as Daniel Motet. The book ends with an extended analysis of the series of autobiographical texts Daniel Motet published in the journal across 1956 and 1957. Much of the chapter is a close analysis of Motet as a figure inside and outside of Socialisme ou Barbarie and as a narrative function in the text. The texts are deceptively simple. They intertwine accounts of everyday experience with viewpoints on that experience, particular to Socialisme ou Barbarie, and are written in a language the art of which is to appear virtually artless. The texts themselves describe Motet's professional life as a machinist in AOC, a limited-run machine shop that primarily produced prototypes and replacement parts. Most relate failed attempts at political mobilization to protest a political question, Algeria, or address problems related to the pace and organization of work. Because of the nature of politics in the factory, when autonomous actions happened, the actors articulated themselves in the language of revolutionary Marxism. This makes of them a unique space of appropriation, one that performed exactly the relation to Marxian language the Socialisme ou Barbarie saw as the natural horizon for autonomous action, but in a particular curious way. It enacted a relation to the language parallel to that of intellectuals in its sensitivity to contextual variations. In the text Motet just published about the period immediately following the Hungarian Revolution, the reader can see this space coming undone. Where Socialisme ou Barbarie saw the Hungarian Revolution as culmination of the mounting wave of working-class revolutionary activity that began soon after Stalin's death, Motet details a basic crisis in the relation of workers to the language of revolution itself. The fragmentation is all the more interesting in the pages of Socialisme ou Barbarie because it lays out the group's focus and seems to anticipate future problems with the Marxist imaginary. The argument is that this fragmentation is an initial instance of what will become the crisis of that imaginary. It provides a way to think about how ideologies come apart. but the situation in which this happens is ambiguous. We defer a conceptual discussion to the postface, as their questions are better posed with the grain of these accounts fresh in the reader's mind. In part, this project is a history of Socialisme Barbarie, while it relies primarily on the journal, where internal documents are still available. The project crosses a path made from fragments from the journal, in which pseudonymous narrative functions address the working class in general, to Socialisme Barbarie as a small militant group that met bi-weekly in the second-floor space of Le Café Tambour, located in Paris, near the Bastille metro stop. Between 1953 and 1957, the group was comprised of around 20 members, 15 of whom attended meetings regularly. Castoriadis, Lefort, and Georges Petit comprised the old guard. The rest had come by 1952 through a variety of routes that will be detailed in the chapters below. The journal's production was the focus of most meetings and the center of the group's collective life. Writing articles, collective discussion, and editing of drafts, discussions about what to publish and when, a slightly different configuration of the group, tended to the material aspects of publication, getting the materials selected to the printer, running galleys back and forth, picking up the print run, wrapping and dispatching issues for subscribers, along with the supplementary items that may be included each, delivering issues to the bookstores. To some Socialisme Barbarie members, this pointed to the internal hierarchy that distinguished, quote, the intellectuals from the, quote, ordinary militants. But as a group, it was the, quote, ordinary militants that largely enabled it to operate. Like any collective, Socialisme Barbarie was a network of personal relationships. It was also a web of correspondence among members called away from Paris for periods of teaching or other longer-term reasons, and between the collective and other political groups, nationally and internationally. Footnote. After 1956, Socialisme Barbarie had cells in other locations, including one quite active on its own terms in the early 1960s in Le Mans. But in the period covered in this project, this is not yet the case. Socialisme Barbarie was also actively in contact with other political organizations outside of France that were engaged in parallel projects. Principal among these was the Johnson Forest Tendency, which later became, quote, correspondence. On this relationship, see Chapter 5 below. End footnote. Alongside contacts with our other political organizations came publications, the receipt of which were noted at the beginning of meetings, but mostly Socialisme Barbarie was a mesh of ongoing discussions. To present themselves to the public, the group organized a study circle on Lenin in 1949. The following year, Castoriadis gave a series of lectures on Marx's Capital, 1950-51, at what is today l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. Later, Socialisme Barbarie periodically held public meetings in the Auditorium at Mutualité in the 5th arrondissement. Each had a particular decentered format as a function of the restrictions placed on the political activities of non-French citizens, which prevented the group's most eloquent speakers, Castoriadis and Vega, from appearing on stage. Many who attended have noted this format. Even in public, Socialisme Barbarie did not work like any other group on the Parisian left. Because of the fragmentary nature of the materials available for the period covered in this book, much of what follows is written using the journal as its analytical center. In the sections devoted to worker writing, I also used copies of, quote, correspondence and Tribune Ouvrière, while I was able to use a considerable amount of internal documentation on the life of the group. There was much more of it for the period from 1956 onwards. A project that dealt with this later period could pose the question of how to write about a collective quite differently. The movement back and forth from the journal to the group enables some observations. Socialisme Barbarie as a group was not exactly in phase with the journal. The group was more internally diverse, a mosaic of revolutionary left political viewpoints. Articles that were published typically involved points of consensus. The group moves in a linear fashion. The journal moves in a linear fashion, with subsequent issues presupposing, building on, or modifying positions from previous issues. Internally, the group was more diffuse. In an open letter from May 1956, in which Castoriadis threatens to leave, Castoriadis complains about the lack of internal continuity, with projects taken up and then abandoned, and how individual positions and discussions never seem to change. The same dissonance affects even the dates that appear on each issue of the journal. It was not at all given that an issue would appear in print anywhere near the date on its cover. What held Socialisme ou Barbarie together was the group itself as a collective process. The journal is an expression of that process. The analysis undertaken in this book uses the idea of the group as a process to shape the overall approach to the material. But the process as it appears in the journal and internal documentation is not identical with that which went into making it. Something basic has long since slipped away. From this follows a certain ambiguity in each of the sentences below that makes of the group a subject followed by a verb. But this is not just an intellectual history of the group. I was also interested in Tribune Ouvrière and the text by Socialisme ou Barbarie member Daniel Motet as accounts of everyday experience in the French automobile industry in the 1950s. It seems to me that if one is to read these texts, one has to have a good understanding of what Socialisme ou Barbarie was doing at the time in order to account for and open up what information there is about shop floor experience, both in what conforms to and exceeds the revolutionary project. This required moving through two quite dense contexts, the one in which Socialisme ou Barbarie operated, and another, quite different context of Renault's Billancourt factory. This in turn required a combination of methodologies drawn from intellectual history, philosophy and literary theory in some places, sociology and the history of work in others. The hope is that the writing makes of this a seamless whole. The combination of social spaces and methodologies opened up ways to think about the Marxist imaginary from different angles, and which would not have been available if the project had remained within a single level of analysis. Socialisme ou Barbarie is important not just for its own production. The open-endedness of the group's relationship to the worker as a signification makes of it a source of information about the nature of work in the early phases of industrial Fordism, and inadvertently about the process whereby Marxism began to come undone as a language workers could appeal to in order to mobilize themselves. These considerations had an impact on when and how this project ends. The idea was to hold Socialisme ou Barbarie at its point of maximum openness in order to allow the question of whether one can see in Motet's text the initial moments of the crisis of the Marxist imaginary. No one was looking for that, not even Socialisme ou Barbarie. In a sense, the book you are holding is a large fragment of the group's history. This was by design, because the idea was to use Socialisme ou Barbarie with and against itself to stage something of the crisis of the Marxist imaginary. I chose to leave questions open for the readers rather than to assimilate them back into the seeming inevitability that follows from a continuous narrative of the adventure of an intellectual group from 1949 to 1967. It also followed the fact that the material is quite complex, and I could not assume familiarity on the part of readers with either Socialisme ou Barbarie or the archival documents. While I am not opposed to following out the rest of the group's history, and it would be possible to do so, given the time and leisure, for now the reader is referred to other sources for an account of this overall narrative. One might first turn to Philippe Gatreau's Socialisme ou Barbarie, un engagement politique et intellectuel dans la France de l'après-guerre. I don't know if I said that right at all. Gatreau's book is a historical sociology of the group that covers the whole of its development, while its analytical dimension is hamstrung by the rigidity of its Bourdieu-inspired framework. The basic history is thorough and the biographical material he presents valuable. The book is important in shifting attention to the group as a collective. It had not yet appeared when I wrote the dissertation on which this book is based. Marcel van der Linden's Socialisme ou Barbarie, a French revolutionary group, 1949 to 1965, provides English-speaking readers with a clear and concise general history of this group. It brings material from Dutch council columnists like K. Ho Brendel, who attended meetings with the group for certain periods. The addition of contemporary outside perspectives on the life of Socialisme ou Barbarie is most interesting, even as they occupy positions within debates that one would prefer to understand. The account of the 1958 split between Lefort and Castoriadis is invaluable for those familiar with the group. Nicolas Poirier's Retour sur la notion de l'expérience prolétarienne covers the same material that can be found in the first part of Chapter 3, with a kind of generality that comes from making a freestanding piece about a text quite tied to the trajectory of the group. Of the more recent work on Socialisme ou Barbarie that discusses the period addressed in this book, the closest in terms of inspiration and material analyzed is Andrea Gabler's Die Despotie der Fabrik und der Vorschein der Freiheit von Socialisme ou Barbarie gesammelte Zeugnisse aus dem fordistischen Arbeitsalltag. Andrea Gabler undertakes a comprehensive analysis of the work of writing published in Socialisme ou Barbarie. It covers several texts not examined below, such as Georges Vivier's Les Vies en Usine, which I do not address because the writing did not conform to the conventions of, quote, proletarian documentary literature, end quote, that organizes my analysis. It also includes analyses of Henri Simon's text on work at l'Assurance Générale Vie, which is touched on in passing, and Philippe Guillaume's 1961 text, Die Semaine en Usine, originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie number 31. Andrea Gabler's approach is more sociological than that which I adopted here. Her piece is well worth the reader's attention. The presentation of Socialisme ou Barbarie tracks the group's particular situation. After the split with the PCI, the group entered a period of isolation. The chapters devoted to this period treat the group largely as if it were its own context. The relation to context changes with the introduction of the worker newspaper project, which entailed crossing from the delimited field of ideological production particular to the revolutionary left to the very different space of factory floor politics at Billancourt. Here, Socialisme ou Barbarie was almost vanishingly small. The publication of Motte's work coincided with an abrupt change in the group's visibility. The last chapter opens onto some of these broader contexts. Because I could not assume familiarity with the text and because I am using a considerable quantity of archival material, the former members of the group were kind enough to give me access to, much of the writing is narrative. The research was done in Paris during 1991 to 92. I had not planned on returning to the dissertation on which this is based, but the experience has been more interesting and rewarding than I expected. So I am pleased that the opportunity has arose thanks to the good offices of Sebastian Budgen and the anonymous readers who found it to be important. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.